we are an organization that confuses many people because we look like a university research lab while at the same time being a company. So there's 200 people, and the company is 26-year-old, and we've built quite a bit of a cryptographic and security underpinnings of the Estonian e-government, including governmental data exchange, digital identity, digital signature, but also fun stuff like internet voting. So we've sort of had a good long time to practice how to build information security before it was cool to call it cybersecurity. And I do like William Gibson's book a lot, but I do feel that the word cyber is so much overused. Anyway, now to the answer. The perspective we have is somewhat interesting because we get cyber attacked a lot, quite a bit. Whenever there is something interesting going on politically or so, then some of the local banks or newspapers or the presidential website gets hit a little bit. And in this case, it's always good to understand what your supply chain is, and understanding the supply chain is something that's not necessarily well developed in Europe. So if I would have one example here is, if we are onboarding a new cloud service in the organization, and we have a process for that, because we don't want to arbitrarily let people put company or customer assets into the wrong place, then we need to, we often, I would say, even harass our service provider to explain who are the primary, secondary, tertiary, whatever data processors. So who are we actually dependent on for this stuff to work? Which communication lines we suddenly need to think about, or where does the personal data go, and which SMS providers are actually seeing all our HR data because they are getting notifications. And sometimes when this stuff doesn't get onboarded. And that's when there is the GDPR angle, which you likely picked up from here, but the cybersecurity angle is a similar one. It's, if something is not on premises, then it is beyond many service providers. Understanding which ones. Are you dependent on a Polish eyeball aggregation company that counts how many people are coming to your website, for example, or an American analytics company? You need to understand that. Understanding that supply chain is important. And the second aspect is, where I see the future going, is collaboration is necessary. In the civil sector, in corporate, possibly also in defense, because collaboration between defense and the civil sector is apparently the new popular thing. Then we need to exchange information about threats in a good and straightforward way in Europe and with allies. That's where I think this is going.
Thank you, and we'll come back to this question on collaboration. Who should we collaborate with, and who should be doing that? Christiane, give us your perspective, you know, within, if you like, the legal, political landscape. There's a lot on the table already, but tell us a bit about how we've got to where we are and what's there at the moment.
Yeah, thank you. So indeed, if you're looking at it from the policy legal perspective, there's been a lot of stuff happening in Europe the last 10 years, which I think everyone agrees has been a good thing considering the situation we're finding ourselves in. So as you know, we've been very busy with the NIS framework. We now have an NIS2 framework for those who don't dabble in cybersecurity on a daily basis. That is a law it's a directive. It's in which we basically mandate cybersecurity requirements via our member states, but for our critical infrastructure. So this is in a field where we have revised the directive recently, where we're covering many more sectors that we say, well, actually these sectors are critical for the function of the economy and of the society. So therefore, these sectors also have to take additional risk management measures and so on. At the same time, we've also been active, of course, building the national, and this is also part of this framework, building the national capacity to actually respond to cybersecurity, but to also prepare for cyber attacks. And we've done a lot of work in terms of preparing, let's say, at the level of coordination, because, you know, we're 27 member states, but cyber attacks don't stop at borders. So it's also extremely important that we're able, and I think you also got into that, to actually have this information flowing across borders within the Union in order for us to have a coherent approach when we do crisis management. One of the more recent things we've been looking at is, of course, related to the supply chain. So product security, because this is where we're looking at when we see the attacks. We see more and more supply chain attacks. We also see that around 2/3 of the incidents that are notified under this framework we have in Europe, so the cyber incidents, they actually relate to vulnerabilities in products that are being exploited. So here we have proposed rules for product security, which are currently being negotiated in the Council. We've also looked at, and this is an area which is, I think, developing a lot, it's to look at the partnership aspects. We're looking at both partnerships, let's say the civ-mil approach, but we're certainly also looking at cooperating more closely with like-minded partners, but also public-private partnerships we see as increasingly important because cyberspace is to a large degree owned by the private sector. If we're looking at key lessons learned from Ukraine, it's also really about the role that the private sector plays in defending critical infrastructure, either because it's owned by them, but also certainly because of the capabilities that a lot of our situational awareness is actually with the private sector. So if we're looking at this is sort of what we've been covering so far. I would say we're not quite done yet, because cybersecurity is very much a game of always staying ahead of the curve. You have the threat actors who are developing, but we certainly also have on the technology side things happening in terms of artificial intelligence, in terms of quantum, that we need to take into account when we're looking at our framework. And I think most importantly, we have to look at the issue of skills, which is an area where, you know, for all of the other things I mentioned to be successful, we need skilled people. And we have a huge lack of skills, not just in Europe, but also globally. But if we take the European perspective, this is an area where we need to do much more. And it's an area where we need to do it in partnership, again, with our member states, with education institutions, but also with the private sector.
Well, you've laid out a lot there. We're going to come back to a lot of those points. Well, let's hear from the private sector. Florian, Christiane mentioned there the NIS directive and NIS 2, which is all about critical infrastructure, but also products, because a lot of those underpin the critical infrastructure. So from the Microsoft worldview, how do you see Europe positioned?
Thanks, and thanks for the invitation. Well, I think that Christiane basically laid out all of the points that I wanted to address, so let me try to just jump on a couple of those. Now, definitely, I want to first start with, very shortly, do realize where we are right now, 2023. We had the COVID pandemic. We, as a technology company and ICT provider, saw an enormous uptake of people using all kinds of technologies. It went really fast. Threat service increased. It also meant that threat actors had more opportunities to be successful. We had to defend more. Don't forget that on the industry side, you're often the first defender, because you see these things. And then we had Ukraine and the Russian aggression against and in Ukraine. And even though I'm extremely pleased that Christiane also says, like, yeah, that's where public-private come together. Of course, we did a lot, but many other industries did a lot as well. And that's something that also shows, okay, we're in this new relationship building where, yeah, it really is public-private, and we need to do a little bit more than just calling out, let's do public-private, let's do public-private. We need to unravel that a little bit into operational, tactical, strategic development. And I must say that at the EU level, I think there are really good progresses going on. So that's a little bit the context. So we're extremely supportive of those developments. Then if you look at a little bit the other things that were mentioned before, skills. The latest figures that we also put out there were that we have a shortage of 3.4 million workers on cybersecurity skilled staff, reaching from people that do incident response to policymakers and lawyers. That's massive, and that's growing. That's not getting smaller. So we really support what the European Commission has put forward, the Skills Academy. We also signed the pledge. And then if you look at legislation that of course underpins that legislates our products and services, that's extremely relevant as well. There we're obviously very supportive as well, although we do have some issues and questions that we often ask, and I think that for the Cyber Resilience Act that you just mentioned, that's ongoing progress. The NIS2 directive, for example, has been adopted. And to be quite honest, I do think that's a great example, because if you look at that legislation, that's a legislation where we call it the NIS2, because there was an NIS1 in 2016. The mindset behind it is fantastic. You first have a broad field where you have a directive, you throw that out in the 27 member states, then you capture and you analyze what has happened, it affected critical infrastructure, and then a couple of years down the line you make a update, which is the NIS2. And for us it's a very important one because it doesn't only legislate us as a company in the EU, it works as a lighthouse. Other regions look at this as well, and that's equally important. And it also legislated our customers in the critical infrastructure sector. So, and I'm sure we're going to touch on some other things as well, because I definitely have some things to say about AI and cyber, but we'll talk about that later.
Good. Dan, yes.
I have let's try all of this together for a moment. I'm giving you a hypothetical scenario. Cybernetica enters software as a service business and we launch a product. We put the back end on the Microsoft cloud, and then the EU launches the NIS on us. And then there is, God forbid it ever happens, but there's a cybersecurity thing that happens on the Microsoft side. Am I guilty for bringing Microsoft into my supply chain, or is Microsoft guilty, or who's guilty? So that's a question that every SME in Europe might be asking one day.
Well, straight to liability. do you want to tackle it?
I mean, I think first the issue of who's guilty is maybe not, I don't know, maybe not the right choice of words, I would say. So what we have is, we have with NIS2, we have established rules. So if you're part of the scope of the NIS2, you also have to secure your supply chain. That's what's in it, right? So that means that you have to carry out due diligence. This you can do, for instance, through your contracts and so on and so forth. So I think as long as you carry out your due diligence and you follow what's required by the law as it's translated into the national regime, then you will be guilty of nothing else than following the rules.
But what contract would you give me, Florian?
Luckily, I'm not in that part of the organization, but no, honestly, I do think that that's the kind of contracts you need to discuss, but it comes, listen, there's the other side to this discussion, right? What we've seen, and we're trying to be as helpful as possible, because we're a larger company, we understand that we take the responsibility. What we see is that many of our customers that are in that, what the EU calls an SME, which is not always the same in every country, and I know that in certain countries it's a different perspective, don't always have the bandwidth to follow everything that's happening here in Brussels for good reasons, or even to see what's happening at the national level. Mm-hmm. So how do you bridge that you know that when you sit down in a contract discussion, you've got the right players and it's an equal discussion. That's something that I've seen over the last couple of years. That's a challenge, because lawyers that can work for companies like ours, or lawyers that can work for companies like yours, if you see that, of course we have the opportunity also, we have to follow way more compliance and legal discussions because we're global, versus somebody in your company that may be 50, 60 staff. Yeah, those roles are completely different. The time that you can allocate for everything is not always the same. Mm-hmm. So to be quite honest, I think that's worth the investment as well. So then we come back to the skills discussion. One of the things that I constantly mention is don't always focus on the technical side. We also need more people that are cyber lawyers, compliance lawyers, policy makers in cybersecurity, because there's a couple of us, but it should be bigger as well, and they should be able to support SMEs at a national level too. And your national certs. I do think that the national certs have under the NIS2 the opportunity to be more supportive towards that group. It's knocking on the door. I used to work in one of them, and we didn't have the staffing and we didn't have the resources. That has changed, and with NIS2, that must change.
So every startup in the room, you now know what you need to do.
Follow the rules.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's also a headache for regulators as well. I mean, because there's also the principle of best efforts, which is a little bit nebulous and hard to pin down. Dan, let me come back to you and ask you kind of a leading question. What keeps you awake at night? Is it AI? What worries you? Is it quantum? Is it William Gibson? What is it that's...
Quantum's 20 years in the future at least. We're building post-quantum e-government, but we feel that we have about 10, 15 years to build it. So we are now technical readiness level 4 in European Commission speak, let's say, but we're getting higher in these advanced apps. AI, sort of, no. AI will make a lot of smart people more efficient at doing menial jobs. That's fine with me. I use it to write my LinkedIn posts on how excited I am at speaking at conferences now. Because if it's too long, I ask him, can you be more concise? And it gives me a more concise version with less hashtags, which is more my style. So I win some time there. But what keeps me up at night is why aren't we doing more in Europe to figure out how to collaborate internationally on data using the technologies that we've invested hundreds of millions into, in Horizon, in all of these programs. And on the other side, for example, on the US side, they have been investing too, and when we had this TTC process over the last few years, and there were negotiations in the AI working group on could we, for example, use privacy-enhancing technologies for data collaborations between the great industrial blocks, then that sort of didn't go anywhere. Whereas we could have had some cool lighthouse projects. I know that White House has put a lot of effort into it. They have this big program with UK. And sort of what I'm asking for is, where is the EU-US privacy technology program that might actually help us with the discussions that we have ongoing on data usage? And yeah, that could help a lot with AI, it could help with cloud. I know Microsoft has a whole R&D unit that works a lot on this, so let's do something about it.
Well, let's take then that point of collaboration. Christiane, I mean, Dan mentioned the TTC, the Trade and Technology Council, and that is trying to do something, but it seems to be a little bit slow. It's a little bit behind closed doors. We're not hearing huge amounts of movement from inside that these sorts of lighthouse projects that Dan's talking about. What do you think is going to happen? Where could we move the lever on collaboration a bit more?
Yeah, so for what concerns collaboration with the US, as you also point out and you also refer to, there of course a lot of work going into it, there's a lot of effort going into it. You mentioned the TTC, the discussions we have there. I think when it comes to, and I'm going to take the discussion back over to cybersecurity as well, when it comes to collaboration with the US on cybersecurity, it is a field where we see, we are digging deeper into it, we are working closer together. Of course, we have the work that we're doing under the TTC for what concerns research and standards and so on and so forth. At the same time, I think it also has to be seen as sort of framed in a broader partnership we have with the US, and which we're developing quite a lot. We have recently, I think, revamped the EU-US cyber dialogue to this extent. Also, to actually go into more closer cooperation in terms of looking at standards that relate to cybersecurity. I think that's very important for our businesses that are operating on both markets, that we're willing and keen to also look with our friends at NIST when we implement the CRA, what are the standards that can give compliance to the CRA, what's happening in the US, and we get better at at comparing and talking and working on this. I think when it comes to protection of critical infrastructure, we have a lot of debates and discussions going on with the US as well now. One of the things we also hear a lot from industry that are operating on both sides is, for instance, you know, with the US now developing more of a, I'm not going to say European approach, but maybe a more, you know, regulatory or mandating more things in terms of incident reporting, for instance. You know, would it be possible that we're also looking at having a little bit, you know, something that resembles the same thing on both sides of the Atlantic? Because if you're operating, you have an incident, you're operating on both markets, of course it would make sense that the approaches are not too different. And we, of course, work with the Americans in terms of information sharing, looking at how we're coordinating crisis. So just to say that on TTC, there are certainly things going on, but we are also developing, I would say, a much deeper relationship with the Americans on cybersecurity through the cyber dialogue.
Well, I mean, I think, Florian, you'd probably agree with all of that. I mean, presumably, as a company, it would be useful if big blocks were having some joined-up thinking.
Yeah, no, I agree. And if you just look at listen, a company like Microsoft is active at national, and let's just keep EU as footprint, right? National level, we have operations, we have conversations ongoing, we have a lot of partners at national level, ranging from SMEs to like multinationals. Then at the EU level, similar activities, but then we see, and this is quite interesting, that if you look at public-private cooperation and getting more knowledge on what's happening in TTC and what's happening in the EU-US cyberdoc, there's always, it's very public. There is a private segment. I think that you did it in December as well. You had a roundtable. We have to be honest. Normally, it's always the larger companies that sit at that table because they have the bandwidth. Again, we need to solve that at one point. NATO, I want to draw in. What I actually see, and this has really been new to me, and I didn't expect it to go that fast. What NATO at the moment is doing and how it's seeking cooperation with industry goes, I think, a bit faster than we had anticipated. We are very supportive of it, especially given the geopolitical instability. But that's something which could be a nice motivator for the EU side to say, hey, what's happening here? Defense that usually is quite, I can't say slow, but more thoughtful. Now is moving more rapid than at an EU level. And we need to bring it together. And there are great opportunities and there are great collaborations already, but that's something where I would say, hey, how can we look at that and then feel that? Because what the fear is that you'll get so many of these different groups where cooperation is being developed by often the same people from industry, and then you spread them thin and you can't really start to do things. And that's a constant challenge.
Well, let me put on my devil's advocate hat. You know, you're saying it's wonderful that things are moving faster, but then there's the side that says, well, hang on, you can move too fast, and particularly with security, it's important to be conscious of what you're leaving open and who you're collaborating with. The words digital sovereignty are bandied about a lot at the moment, and you know, some people say, oh, you can't build Fortress Europe. We have discussions around our criticism of a so-called EU cloud, which, again, we'll see what's actually going to happen there. But Dan, what's your take on this whole area? Is there an optimal speed to move at, an optimal level of collaboration?
There is a thing that's too fast. I found it out very first-hand this year. Some of you may know that Estonia is one of the brave nations that has internet voting because we have a mature digital identity infrastructure and we can, with sufficient certainty, say that a certain digital vote was cast by a certain person, which is not the case for all these internet voting efforts. This year, last election was Parliament in, I think, April, sorry, and we crossed the threshold. We had more digital votes than paper votes, 50.3%. We are now on that side of the world where maturity has reached a point where a lot of people are using an infrastructure but not necessarily fully understanding it. So the internet voting system is filled to the brim with zero knowledge proofs, mixed nets, all the fancy tech to ensure that nobody can steal the election with too feasible probability. And but the problem is that the election observers don't have the maturity to understand that tech anymore very easily. It's hard to find election observers who understand what's going on and what the technology does. There are whole separate training programs that the electoral committee has for this to sort of explain what is a zero knowledge proof and how do I prove a mixed net result. The mixed net does things like it shuffles the votes so you don't know their origins anymore before you do the ballot process. So, and after that last election, there has been a major national discussion on is the society no longer capable of observing the democratic process? And we are scarily close to that point. We do have enough capacity right now to maintain this and go on, and we teach it at universities, and there are people with PhDs in cryptography who can sort of say that, yeah, that's looked all right, and there's international peer-reviewed papers and all that say, yeah, that did look all right, but I'm constantly worried that we'll need a few new generations who sort of start understanding what data is and where it goes before we can start launching anything massive and new. So I'm very worried about the skills gap, yes.
Well, at a far less serious level than in Estonian elections, that we have real-world examples of that. Last year, the Eurovision was apparently hacked, and the AI ruled that this did not look like a normal voting pattern. But again, they put out a 10-page explanation of why it was not a normal pattern, and most people, certainly most Eurovision watchers, couldn't make head nor tail of it. But this brings me back around to the point of skills, I think, Christiane. I mean, we have a skills shortage for people in specific jobs and roles, as Florian was saying, and they're being spread ever thinner. Do we have a general population skills shortage when it comes to understanding cybersecurity, and what do we need to do about it? Tell us a bit as well about the Cybersecurity Skills Academy. I know there's work being done from the Commission side.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, and I think, by the way, it's a very good example that you're bringing up, and this whole link that actually the lack of skills and the lack of understanding, not just in terms of cybersecurity, but in terms of how does digital work, how does AI work, what does it actually do? It is something that that we need to take extremely seriously, because it has a link to everything we do in society. The more we digitalize, the more fundamental it is. I think when we're looking at skills, you know, on the one hand, we're talking about the lack of skills in cybersecurity, and Florian, you mentioned it, it's certain profiles. Who are these profiles? It's incident reporters, it's policy wonks, it's people who can help SMEs and startups, you know, that's certainly a clear area. But there's a different story as well, which is the more broad digital skills. There are also not necessarily just digital skills, but also in the age of disinformation, there's also skills such as critical thinking. The fact that we need to teach our kids, our generation, and ourselves that what we see on the internet could very likely just be a deep fake. So we have to have full-on critical thinking at everything we see. It's a different way of looking at the world. It's a different way of learning. So to say that this thing, I mean, we need to do things in cybersecurity, but we certainly also need to do things already in the schools and very early in the schools for the digital skills. Now, when it comes to cybersecurity and the skills framework, I mean, as a general thing at the European level, we do not have the European competence to really stick our hands in it. This is not how it works. So education is a national competence. So it also means that, you know, we cannot just, let's say, put in what we've done on cyber in general to say, here's a framework, dear member states, work together with us and implement it. So instead of, and this is where also springs the idea of the Skills Academy, we brought together this notion of an academy that actually pulls on different strands that are already happening in society. And I think the first thing which I want to underline that it does. It's actually, it needs to help us get some figures on the table. Because, you know, what you like to say is, you know, when you can monitor, you can also manage. And one of the issues we have now is that there is no visibility on how many. You have one figure, you're talking millions. We hear figures 300,000, 500,000, you know. It's very, we think this. The second thing is on profiles. What are the profiles we're missing? What are the profiles we're missing today? But also what are the profiles we'll be missing in the medium term and the long term? These things also have to be calibrated, of course, because we have to consider it into the system. Then you have to look at pathways, you know, considering what we are today as a society, what are the skills available today, and we want to get over here. How do we create the pathways to take the skills we have today and shape them, you know, additional education, and form them so they can meet the skills of the future. So this is, I would say, one strand of work. We have another strand of work, and you also mentioned it, which relates to the pledging. Because I think it's important to underline that the situation we're in today, it's not going to be fixed by the public sector alone. The education system cannot push out enough. That means that the private sector, also being the ones who are in demand of these skills, also has an important role to play in order to help support the development of the skills. So I think we're very grateful for the companies that are coming forward, for the institutions, everyone coming forward and putting in this pledge to say, you know, we're part of this, we're in it together, and we're doing it together. And finally, of course, I mean, we're looking at training programs, looking at curricula, but we're also looking at how can we leverage, although we do not have competence at the European level for rules and laws, we do have the European budget. So there's also this issue, how can we leverage what we have in terms of the European budget to support the skills? And this is indeed part of what will also be in the Skills Academy. It is funding programs and support to also further develop it.
Well, you've brought it up, so let's dive into the question of money, funding. How big a shortfall is there in Europe for providing those skills? I mean, and where does the funding need to come from? Florian, what's your take? I mean, people might look at Microsoft and say, you've got lots of money, can't you fund all these skills?
Well, actually, what Christiane said, we signed the pledge, and we've set up multiple of these cooperation models with educational institutions in the US already, with colleges, where we're looking at doing, and I think in some countries we already do the same here in the EU. So we are there, and we are committed, and we're investing. The other side to this, and I do want to give a shout out to, I think it's ENISA that created 13 or 14 or some profiles, really cybersecurity profiles, ranging from what I mentioned before, the cyber lawyer, to the incident responder, to the reverse engineer in cyber. That's extremely relevant to understand there's differentiation, and you don't want to have every bucket allocated in the same way, right? You don't need as many lawyers as you would need reverse engineers or vice versa. So I'm really in favor of what you mentioned with quantifying, putting some real figures on it, and having independent institutions look at that and come up with this. And then there's two nice things to this as well that I want to mention, right? Actually, last Friday I was invited by the kindergarten class of my daughter. She's 5, to give a presentation about cybersecurity. And the funny part is, so I was thinking, how do I do this? I'm Microsoft. Do they know the Microsoft logo? I was weirdly surprised that 4 out of the 20 knew the Microsoft logo. And then I put Minecraft on there. Minecraft, yeah. Right? It was pretty, it's not easy. That class of 5- and 6-year-old all knew Minecraft. So that means that they are already online, and that starts with the digital skills. So you want to. So the first thing that I said is, hey, listen to the director who I met outside. Like, we need to do something about this, because that means that they are online, they're exposed. That means that the parents need to know. So it starts there, but it doesn't end there. One of the things that I am truly annoyed about is that we always focused on where it's most sexy and where people are most engaged. Don't forget the elders. Don't forget the seniors. Don't forget your grandparents or that didn't have all of this. They are also online because their grandchildren call them with WhatsApp. Focus on that too. And the last thing, cybersecurity, what I really love, I've been in this field now for 15 years, the best hackers, the best technology wonks often don't have that traditional university background. Yeah. So we don't have to push everybody through what we think is best. Be innovative.
Yes, a lot of the pen testers are out there saying very much that. Dan, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, small follow-up to that. I very much liked what you just said. There's two issues here. First of all, they start with Minecraft. I had to start with Microsoft DOS. There was nothing to do on it. But one day
we all have
found,
a band of sympathy for Dan.
Yeah. So my age is showing, I know. But there was QBasic.com there. That was the most interactive thing in MS-DOS. That's a programming language interpreter. Means that was the most fun you could have with a clean MS-DOS machine, which means a lot of kids learn to code on these machines. These days they learn to code-ish on Minecraft. I would argue that one of them hides the actual abstractions of a computer much better than the others. It's like, I'm a little bit worried that the young people we're hiring in our company these days, they don't understand how computers work anymore, because they're working with the computer through 14 levels of abstraction. However, these abstractions are very helpful. I got my grandfather an iPad when he was 92. He died last year at an age of 101. He used the iPad until that time.
Fantastic.
And that's amazing. I don't think he would have survived on MS-DOS.
Well, fortunately, he didn't have to. But I think you're raising an interesting point, and I don't want us to delve off into starting to talk about med tech. But we have a lot of innovators and startups in the room, and we had our digital challenge yesterday, and we even saw with Eric's presentation that, with an aging population, with increasing medical needs, there is going to be a need to become more digitally literate, because a lot of these devices or a lot of the tools like IABLE and so on are going to be useful and helpful and may improve the quality of our lives significantly. But, there's always a but, health data is extremely sensitive data. It's very personal, it's very private. And so, of course, the commensurate cybersecurity must be incredibly important. You wanted to talk, I think, about AI, Florian. So tell me what you wanted to say about that, and then I want to try and bring that back into talking about how that might be useful in the future for people.
Now, why I wanted to mention it, because I do think that we... Let's face it, the Commission has put out a lot of legislation over the last 4 years, and that's going to require a lot of people to understand what it is about, to be compliant, and that trickles down. At the same time, we see that new technologies are being developed and deployed, and even though AI has multiple things underneath, what we sometimes shouldn't forget, especially here in Brussels, that it's not all bad. It allows you to do things faster, sometimes also better, with less resources. That's a very important paradigm shift for the cybersecurity environment, because 10, 15 years ago, when you would walk into a SOC or a CERT, you would see boys and girls touching the buttons, doing a lot of things by hand. Then we had new systems coming up. We had CTI and now we are really at what my ultimate boss calls the inflection point, where you just see that this will really change a whole new perspective of how do we deal with cybersecurity threats. We will be able to see more, we will be able to do it faster, with lesser resources, or actually with the same resources you'll be able to cover more. That's what I wanted to infuse in this discussion. That will require people that do not only understand cybersecurity skills, because I bet you the next thing will be AI skills and sustainability skills.
We had that panel yesterday.
So that's all coming up. And in the end, there needs to be some overlap where it can be complementary.
Well, that leads us nicely into I want to spend the last few minutes focusing a bit more on the positives. We've talked about a lot of the challenges, the concerns, and where maybe there are gaps, and skills is coming up once again as one of these areas that really needs to be addressed. But perhaps I could start with, instead of asking Dan what keeps you awake at night, what makes you hopeful? I mean, where do you see strengths in the cybersecurity world globally, but or Europe particularly? Do we have any particular strengths we can draw on? I mean, we've got a legislative sort of framework, more or less, even though there's some elements that are still being developed. But where might those strengths lie?
I'm a great believer in collaboration. I do believe that the GDPR thing is a good thing in the end. I do believe that we can figure out how to exchange data with our friends in North America. I think this can be done. And I have to admit that over the year, once we've had the Ukraine issue. So, quick background, Cybernetica has been making e-government in Ukraine for some years now. We've been building their platforms. So last year wasn't good for business, is I think the understatement of the week award. And this is a time where I have to applaud Microsoft for actually lending a lot of help to Ukraine on their infrastructure cybersecurity side. This is great stuff. Thank you, sir. However, there's not just infrastructure, but also services. So building new services, that's going to be a thing in Europe, because I don't want us to get left behind to Southeast Asia and North America, who happen to be building services with much less restraints. Fair enough, so let's build those services, let's build them the European way, in a collaborative fashion. And what makes me hopeful is that I saw so much innovation during COVID in European digital infrastructure. This was like breakneck speed. Some stuff was done wrong, like the thing that you couldn't revoke vaccination certificates, but we can get past that. Estonians can tell you how this works. Sorry, that was a bad joke. And the other thing that helps me is also, you mentioned defense and collaboration. The fact that defense industry is increasingly starting to use civilian infrastructure, Starlink being a prime example. That's like connectivity anywhere on Earth. And they don't have a big military-only industrial thing for it. They used Elon's Starlink. So I think that's a part where we will see a lot of innovation, especially where we see that Europe has been putting a lot of investment into the European Defense Fund. And this is for countering information warfare, deepfakes, and doing cybersecurity for the next generation vehicles. That will also increase maturity of the technologies elsewhere. And maybe some of the approaches that we've been using to secure the same internet voting thing and do risk analysis there can be used to analyze the security of an armored vehicle, if this is the time in the history of mankind that we've been given to live in.
Christiane, what makes you hopeful? Is it the Cyber Solidarity Act? Is it something else?
It's obviously a Cyber Solidarity Act, and all our acts always make us hopeful. No, I think I would actually rather say that what makes me hopeful, and it certainly relates to both Ukraine but also to COVID, is the fact that cybersecurity is no longer something that's just discussed in a small group of CISOs. Mm-hmm. Cybersecurity, I bet most CISOs got a call from the CEOs asking where are we on this, because it has become something which is, I think, understood at the very highest level, whether it's in business or whether it's in politics or wherever we are, it's gone to the highest level. I think everyone have understood what we have been saying for a long time, which is that if you want to look at our resilience, if you want to understand, where are our vulnerabilities as a society, cybersecurity is absolute key. And I think this actually makes me hopeful, because we see so much being invested into digital, whether it's for the election systems or for how we run basically the most essential parts of our society. And I think, not to point fingers at the past, but I think there's always been this, yes, we can invest, we can make everything move much faster, we can become much more efficient, but we've forgotten that by doing that, we left out also a big part, which is about our vulnerabilities, that we're making ourselves vulnerabilities. And I think this is the thing that has shifted, which is extremely important and makes me hopeful that I think everyone now understands that this is something that's important, whether you're an SME or a startup or you're the prime minister of a country. You need to take it seriously.
And I think we're going to hear a lot more about the cybersecurity around elections next year with the European elections. I'm sure we'll be all tired of hearing about it by this time next year. Florian, what are you hopeful about?
What I really like, because what Christiane has said is and also Dan, I agree with all of this, right? What I really like is I've had, one of my first jobs was intelligence service, and then I went over to the National Cybersecurity Center, and I've seen how people became more open for collaboration with the industry, where in the beginning it was like, oh, no, you cannot, they don't understand it, you shouldn't work with them, they're not mandated by law, they do whatever they want. And you see that that has tilted because people have moved over and they crossed over. Cybersecurity is per definition where you can work 5 years in academia, 5 years in industry, and then 5 years in the police. I'm super hopeful about that, because that means that those people will continuously seek collaboration, grow in their roles, and eventually just help strengthen cybersecurity, because that shouldn't stop. I am a little bit afraid about one thing, is that we overdo it. Because we put cybersecurity on such a pedestal, it's much more underneath. We need to go and look a little bit underneath that pedestal. Okay, what are the real buckets that we have to invest in? And it can't always be legislation, it can't always be technology. It really is also what's coming at us that we haven't defined yet. But we've got a lot of people in there now. So.
Well, we're going to leave human error out of the scope of this panel, well, fortunately or unfortunately. Thank you all very much for an enjoyable and enlightening discussion. Big round of applause, please, for our speakers.